Hi everyone, my name is James. Welcome to King's Fine Woodworking. Today I'm going to show you how to build a very useful little jig if you like to make cutting boards. I know a lot of woodworkers out there build and sell cutting boards, and there's a big demand for cutting boards with the juice groove in it. And one of the tough things is to get this juice groove just perfectly in there all the way around the outside, equidistance from the edges, and when it comes together in the corners it needs to be perfect. And with this jig you can do just that. The big advantage of this jig is that it will work with any size cutting board, and it only takes about 10 seconds to put the cutting board in and set it up. This jig is made entirely out of plywood. The base piece of plywood itself, I did have to go over to Rockler and buy a 30-inch by 30-inch piece of 3/4 inch Baltic birch, and I think I paid about 20 bucks for that, but you may have a piece that size sitting around. And all of the smaller pieces of plywood I just had in scrap, so I was able to use that without having to buy anything. What I'm going to do now is just take the time to carefully lay out where I want all of the T-track to go. This jig has got 5 different pieces of T-track. And the T-track is what's going to allow us to move the fences around to accommodate any size cutting board. And since there are so many different pieces of T-track, I wanted to lay them all out carefully on the surface so that I can see what I'm working with first. I will take the time to carefully note exactly where the T-track is going. Here I'm just going to temporarily put these fence sections in place and kind of get a feel for how this is going to work. What's facing me, closest to me, is going to be the front fence. The one on my right is the right fence. And the front fence has to have the ability to slide back and forth this way to accommodate shortening or lengthening cutting boards. And I think the cutting board is going to go in something like this. And we'll adjust that to fit there. Then we will move the other one down and slide it over appropriately, and then this one is going to move into place to sort of lock the cutting board into where it goes. And it's kind of gives you a vague idea of how it goes. And there's the T-track that's going to allow that piece to slide back and forth. Of course, the jig wouldn't really have very much use if we couldn't put grooves in cutting boards of any size. So basically, I'm going to do a little test out here of a small cutting board. This is just a mock-up. That's not really a cutting board. And it looks like we'll be able to accommodate something all the way down to this size. Okay, so I've got the first fence located, and I have decided how it's going to slide with my T-track layout. And let's look at the second fence. This is what I would have called the right fence. This one has to slide forward and back, and left and right. So this fence is just a little more complicated. I think T-track in these locations are going to allow this fence to slide forward and backwards. And so we'll just go ahead and do a layout for those and put them exactly where I want them to go. It probably looks like I'm kind of shifted off to the left here as opposed to getting these a little more centrally located, and there's a reason for that. It's because the fence that is now on my right, which we haven't shown yet, that has to slide over and encroach into this area. So I can't have these being shifted too far to the right, and that's why they're going to be set up here being a little more to the left. Again, I'm just taking my time to carefully lay out exactly where I want this T-track to go, and I'm identifying it. That way I can get a feel for what the top of this is going to look like. I do have a comprehensive set of plans for this, and there's a link for those in the description. And if you decide to build this, you'll do the same thing I'm doing here. You'll take your time and do a careful layout of where the T-track goes. Okay, and with the fence back in place, there's my T-track. We can see this is going to slide forward and backward on the T-track, but in addition to that, this thing has to slide left and right. So I'm going to end up putting a slot in the top of this board, and I'm just going to loosely draw what I'm talking about here. And this slot is going to allow me to put some bolts through there. And that's going to allow this thing to slide left and right and forward and back. And this is the only fence that has to slide in 2 directions. The other fences will just slide in a single direction. Okay, let's rotate it 90 degrees one more time. And now I have the back fence facing me. And we'll do the layout for this fence. So this fence will only have to slide in one direction, and that's forward and backward. And I think we'll just need a pair of T-tracks right there, and that will accommodate that. So this project is for all of you woodworkers out there who have sent me dozens of emails over the past few months asking for a quick and simple jig to help you make these cutting boards. That's actually the sole reason that we designed and created this, was for you all. So thank you for supporting us on this channel, and thanks for your emails. I'd also like to take a moment to mention our community. We have a community on Facebook, the Kings Fine Woodworking community. There's about 5,000 members. It's actually a closed group, but it's for woodworkers only. And anybody who joins, what we do is there's woodworkers of every different level, from beginner to expert. You can post pictures of your work. You can ask questions. And I get exclusive deals, discounts, and things like that, and I post links to those. We write articles about woodworking, and it's basically a fun group where everybody helps everybody. So if you're interested at all, I'll put a link to the group in the description, and you are welcome to join that. All right, next my daughter Maya is going to take this over to the table saw. I've put a 3/4 inch wide dado blade in there, and I have it all lined up, and we are going to start cutting out these dados. When cutting the dados for T-track, it's really important to make sure you keep pressing down tightly the whole way through as it goes through the table saw blade, because if the board has any upward bow, your dado might not be deep enough in a certain portion, so your T-track won't be buried. And we'll do a quick test fit, and that looks pretty good for that one. Okay, so I'm going to cut some of these other dados here, and what I've done is I have the fence adjusted, and everything's just kind of done by eye here, no careful measuring. That's one of the reasons I took the time to do the layout carefully, was so that I could sort of line it up, line my board up with the fence and over the dado stack. And I think if it's a 1/16 or even an 1/8 of an inch off, one way or another, left or right, it really won't make any difference. And I'm going to take and I'm going to cut it, making sure I press down firmly, up to a certain point and then stop. I'm maybe going to go about an inch or two past where I need to go, and then I'll stop, I'll turn the saw off, and I'll just carefully lift the board straight up. Now I can slide the board over and get it up close to the dado again, slide my fence over to match, and you want to make sure your saw comes to a complete stop. I didn't quite do that, so don't you do that. And you can line it up for the next cut, lock your fence down, and just repeat the same procedure. I did take the time to measure how far forward I wanted my board to go with respect to the blade, and I determined that was right at the start of my outfeed table. That's how I knew where to stop each time. And if we take a look, those look pretty good. They even just about followed right into the tracks where I wanted them originally. So we're just going to rotate that around and repeat the same procedure for the last 2 dado cuts. I'd really like to take a moment to thank everyone who uses the Amazon affiliate links to make the purchases that they need. We do get a small percentage of commission from Amazon, and that goes directly to the channel, and that's one of the main ways we fund the channel. Affiliate links and the plan sales that we make, and our supporters on Patreon. Without that, we would not have a channel on YouTube, which is something we really enjoy. So I just really want to say thank you very much to everybody who takes the time to do that. It really means everything to us. Okay, so with that wraps up the rest of the dado cuts. And we can take a look at what they all look like there. Looks a little bit confusing, I suppose, but it's not too bad. Now we can take it over and install the miter track. Let's first put some of our fences together. So I have it designed so that the width of the fence elements, the part that the edge of the router is going to ride up against, they're exactly 1 inch wide, and so I can kind of use these as a layout to know where to glue them onto the little sub base portion. And I'm just going to apply glue and then staples. I have a crown stapler. You could use a finish nail or you could put screws. I'm just using this because it holds plywood down really well. So I'll put 4 or 5 staples in, I'll put glue, and I think that's going to pretty much hold forever. These staples are going to hold it in place until the glue cures. And we may have some cutting boards that are taller than others, so I'm going to go ahead and make this fence double height. So not only can we accommodate cutting boards of various sizes, we should also be able to accommodate cutting boards of all different thicknesses. And look at that, very little squeeze out. So all of you people out there who got mad at me for wasting glue, I know who you are. It's like 2 of you. That should make you happy. Alrighty, so next here I am going to need to put that groove in, the slot that's going to allow me to move the right fence back and forth from left to right and forward to back. So I have a 1/4 inch spiral upcut bit in my router table, and I've got it raised up about halfway, and I've got my table marked so I can plunge in and go a certain distance and stop and lift off, because I really don't want the slot to go all the way through from left to right anyway. And that's how the slot looks there thus far. We're going to increase the depth on the router bit and cut that all the way through the board. Okay, there we go. So for the final pass, this is coming all the way through the board. And you can see I was pretty close actually to my rough sketch. This is the one that I just kind of put a quick layout on the top by hand to give you an idea of where I wanted that slot to be. Alright, so there we have it. That's all the way through. But as it turns out for this particular board, the bolt that is going to go through it, the T-bolt, is actually 5/16 of an inch, which is bigger than this router bit. So I have to make the cut wider. And then what I did is I moved my fence back, or forward, sorry, just a tiny bit. I did a little test cut there and checked the bolt, made sure that it worked, and it does. And I'm actually going to go ahead and drop this in and cut this the rest of the way. This is just going to widen up the groove a little bit. So the bolt will slide back and forth easily. And a little test fit all the way across confirms that that will work just fine. So now we're going to take these back over to the assembly table and put it together. Same layout here. Maya is going to use these 1 inch wide strips to know exactly where to glue the fence portion down. And she can feel where she wants it left to right, make sure it's centered, and then feel front to back there. So we know it's aligning all the way with the edge of the base part. And we'll do the same thing, put in about 4 or 5 staples, and that'll be good for that. Once again, we're going to double up the height so we get a little bit taller. That way, if our cutting board is thicker, when the router base is sitting on the cutting board and sliding over to the edge, it will have a fence to bump up against in case the cutting board's extra thick. T-track time. First thing we need to do is cut it to length. So I'm going to put it in as far as I want. I'll make a pencil mark. Oh, did you see that shop dog sneak by over there? I did. All right, we're going to mark it to the size that we want. And I'm going to mark the other one here too. And then Maya will take this over to the chop saw and cut through it. You can actually cut through aluminum no problem on the chop saw. You just have to cut real slow. So typically when we cut aluminum on the chop saw, the edges are sharp. They'll scratch you. They'll scratch any wood you might put on the top. So I always take a minute, use a file, and I file all the edges down, file them, round them over a little bit so that they're not sharp and they won't scratch any of our wood. To put these in, we just use a VIX bit. That's V-I-X. That is a self-centering drill bit. That's what we use for hinges as well. It's got a little tip on it there that centers the drill in that hole, and it's a little spring-loaded so the drill bit pushes out through the end, and that gives us a perfect hole for us to put the screws in. I also happen to have this whole jig elevated. I've got some pieces of plywood under it because the only screws that I happened to have were a little bit too long. So all of these screws, unfortunately, are going to poke out of the bottom on mine. And rather than go buy some new screws, I just went ahead and let that happen. And I'm going to grind them off from the bottom side in just a minute. We'll show you how we did that. And that's what it looks like when that's all done. So I just have an angle grinder, and it only takes about 1 second per screw. They'll just grind right off flat, and then I'll rub it back and forth over the point where the screw came out to make sure the metal gets ground slightly below the surface. And we'll finish it up with some sandpaper on the random orbit sander just to make it smooth. So it's not terribly attractive, but I'm not going to bother to take the time to make it the bottom of this jig perfectly smooth and attractive. And it took me a minute to do this, but it saved me a trip to the store. You could always go get some shorter screws if you like. All right, so the fence that's facing me now is the left fence, and this fence gets permanently mounted. This is the only fence that does not move. So I have some 1¼ inch screws. That's just the right length to go through both pieces of plywood and not stick through. And that's how we're going to mount this thing. I've got it lined up perfectly flush with one edge of my base, and we're just going to put these things in, and this thing will never move again. Okay, so I have rotated the whole unit clockwise, and this is now the front fence that's facing me. This is the one that simply has to slide left and right with respect to where I'm sitting here. So I've marked some locations of where I might like to have some holes on that. And now I need to know exactly where those holes are going to locate. So I'm just going to line up that fence flush with the front of my board and just take a little look and use a small square and get a location for where I need those holes to be. And I'll just take my combination square and draw a straight line all the way across, and that'll help me know where to put the holes in. I'm also going to loosen the holes, widen them just a little bit so the bolt can go in and out a tiny bit easier. Or you could just be smarter than me and jump up one drill bit size. So we're going to do a little test fit, put these in and see how this thing slides left to right. That doesn't look too bad. At any given time we will probably have 3 bolts in, but we can go all the way down to 2 and it should still function. So here I have actually flipped the jig 180 degrees, and now I am looking at the back fence. The back fence is facing me. The back fence also only moves in one linear motion, but this one moves forward and backward as opposed to left and right. So I'm going to mark the exact location where I want these holes to go. Time to give this one a test and see how it works. I do have a link to the hardware that I used to build this project. That is in the description below if this is something that you're wanting to build. And I think that works nice and smooth. Okay, so now we can turn our attention to the final fence segment. This is the one which we're calling the right fence. This one has to move forward and backward as well as left and right. For this fence, we don't have to drill any holes at all because it already has a slot in it, and the slot, if you remember, is what's going to allow it to slide left and right. All right, now the fun part. We're going to test the functionality of the whole jig. So we're just going to try one cutting board here. First thing I'm going to do is line it up with the stationary fence, which is the left fence. And then I've slid the other fence down to the right point, locked it down. I've slid the right fence down, and finally the back fence down. In fact, it's happening faster than I can talk. It only takes about 10 seconds to really set it up where we want, and then a few more seconds to lock each of the wing nuts down. And that's it. It's in, it's ready, and the next step is just simply to cut the juice groove. Well, let's go ahead and loosen it up, take it out, and see how difficult it is to switch cutting board sizes. I've got a much smaller cutting board that we're putting in here. And so the first one is the front fence. We've got to slide that down to the left till it's flush with the edge of the cutting board. Then we've got to take and slide the right fence over to that and then down so that it's flush with the top. And finally, we'll bring the back fence down into contact with that. And that's it. So we've changed cutting board sizes. And we just want to make sure that it does fit snug all the way around. It's important to pull these fence components down tight so that it's snug. That way our juice groove is uniform all the way around. And now that one's ready to have a juice groove cut as well. So let's do it. We'll give it a shot here. I'm using what's called a core box bit to make this juice groove, and you can buy these in various widths. And I'm just plunging in about 1/4 inch in depth. I think that's a size that looks pretty good. It's important to point out that I have this set up for a normal full-size router, which has a base of about 6 inches, which puts the center of the bit about 3 inches away from the edge. And this is something that you can adjust if you want your juice groove further in from the edge or closer to the edge. And you would just adjust that by your base piece. You would have a little bit wider or a little bit narrower. But I kind of like this distance from the edge of my cutting board, and that's what I will always use. And most people tend to do something very much like this. And that's really it. Didn't take too long. I had to stop and adjust my cord partway through, so I had to stop and pull the raise up the plunge mechanism. But if we take a look, it still actually made a really good cut anyway. And being able to cut continuously all the way around made it so I didn't really make any burns in the wood. So I would call that a very successful cut, and it's a pretty successful juice groove jig. So that's it for this episode. It's all done. I hope you guys liked it, and thanks for watching.